Welcome to the Harold B. Lee Library's House of Learning Lecture Series. I'm Mike Hunter, the coordinator for this year's lecture series. In the Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, verse 119, it says, "Organize yourselves and establish a house, even a house of faith, a house of learning." Through this lecture series, the Harold B. Lee Library seeks to establish a house of learning by bringing scholars and students together for a discussion of ideas. And we are pleased to have as our featured speaker today, Darren Hawkins, Professor of Political Science at BYU, where he is currently the department chair of the Department of Political Science. Darren Hawkins teaches and researches on international relations, human rights, and international organizations. He has co-edited a volume with Cambridge University Press, Delegation and Agency in International Organizations, and published a book with Nebraska University Press, International Human Rights and Authoritarian Rule in Chile. He has also published a number of scholarly articles on international human rights, international institutions, and democracy. He received undergraduate degrees in Spanish and political science at the University of Utah and a PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has taught at Dartmouth College, Tulane University, and the College of William and Mary in Virginia. Please join with me in welcoming Professor Hawkins.
Thank you so much for having me today, and thank you for coming. I'm very pleased to be here, and I hope to present today some research that sort of a combination of things. Some research that I'm working on now on the spread of democracy around the world, in combination with some research that I've done previously on how that worked in one particular case, the case of Chile. I thank today Taylor Richards, who research assistant, who did, if there's anything virtuous, lovely, or praiseworthy about these PowerPoints, she did it. The lousy content is still mine. And Mark Jackson, actually, who did some really wicked maps we'll be looking at here in a little bit. So the cool-looking stuff is all by other people. Okay. So we have a debate that's been going on in this country for the last several years on whether or not democracy can be exported. Can we, in fact, transplant democracy to other countries? Here is then President Bush from November 2003, an address to the National Endowment for Democracy. We've witnessed, in a little over a generation, the swiftest advance of freedom in the 2,500-year story of democracy. Historians in the future will offer their own explanations for why this happened. The future's now. Yet we already know some of the reasons they will cite. It is no accident that the rise of so many democracies took place in a time when the world's most influential nation was itself a democracy. So President Bush, as is well known, was a big believer in, yes, you can export democracy, and yes, the United States is an important factor in the rise of democracy over the past 20 or 30 years. Okay? There are a lot of people out there who are quite skeptical of this kind of a proposition. One is Eva Bellin, who's at Harvard University. She says, outsiders can at best play a marginal role in fostering democracy in any given country. The primary thing that outside forces can do is to remove the supports, financial and political, that prop up authoritarian regimes, or perhaps remove the coercive apparatus that smashes democratic initiatives in a given country. That will help foster the breakdown of authoritarianism. But whether that will be replaced by democracy is another story. Ultimately, democracy must be homegrown. So we have here two very different points of view about whether or not democracy is exportable. And one hears these points of views echoed and replayed and debated and discussed in society generally. I would like to then take up this question today. I want to ask this question: how and to what extent do states influence the level of democracy in other states? This is a research question that has driven me for the past 15 years or so. I've done lots of other things, but I keep returning to this one time and again. So my dependent variable, what it is I want to explain then, is the level of democracy in a given state. Now I'm going to be using the word polity a lot. Polity is a measure of democracy that's commonly used in political science. So it's a scale of democracy from -10 to 10, -10 being a very authoritarian regime, 10 being a democratic regime, and lots of different variations in between. So it's a 21-point scale. Now, also in a lot of what I say hereafter, we should remember that there might be some kind of difference between what happened during the Cold War and what happened after the Cold War. International relations sometimes, states in the international arena behaved very differently in the Cold War than they have after the Cold War. So we'll be asking a question about, okay, does that matter for the spread of democracy as well? Now let's see, what do we know about this? Well, we know quite a lot about the spread of democracy, or we know something about it. I think we could learn a lot more. One of the things that seems reasonably well established, as Gleditch and Ward say here, is that democratization cannot be seen exclusively as a result of functionally similar processes unfolding independently within each country. In other words, we used to sort of see democracy as very much bubbling up from within any given country. We don't see it that way anymore so much, because there is simply too much evidence of waves of democracy. The states sort of move together on this. That there is a time where states all become somewhat more democratic, and then there's a time when, if you look at long periods of history, where a large number of states become somewhat less democratic, more authoritarian, and then back again, okay? So depending on how you count this, we're in our third or fourth wave of democracy, or maybe we're in a backsliding period. There's different ways to divide up the world, and the history of the world with this respect. But for the most part, it seems pretty robust finding that states have something in common here, that they are influencing each other. And the most common findings on this in this regard are percentage of nearby democracies and percentage of global democracies. So a good predictor of whether or not you will be more democratic next year is whether countries around you became more democratic this year, okay? That's what we mean by percentage of nearby democracies, or changes in nearby democracies. So if you have lots of democracies around you, you are more likely to become more democratic. Or if people around you are becoming more democratic, you are also more likely to become democratic. Also, this seems to work, as I was talking about with the waves, with global democracy. So the more democracies there are in the world, the more likely you are to become democratic as well. So this is very different, actually. So these scholarly findings, first of all, I guess the first thing to point out is these scholarly findings are quite different than the policy debate I introduced just a moment ago. In the policy debate, the question was, is the United States driving this, or does it bubble up from within? And what scholars have found is really neither. It kind of goes in waves, and neighbors seem to matter. Okay. The main problem, I think, with these studies so far is that they've focused on geographic proximity as the most important way in which democracy might move from country to country, from state to state, without investigating other possible pathways. There are, in fact, other possible connections between states, not just geographic proximity. Maybe democracy moves along some of those connections. So what I want to think about is how states are dependent. How are states dependent on each other? And I want to think about this concept of dependence then. Dependence then is the value that actors place, in my case states and countries in the international arena, the value that actors place on goods they can obtain through an exchange relation, taking into account their alternative sources of those goods. Okay, another way to think about this then is need fulfillment that would be costly to forego. Okay, so if I'm a state, what are some of the things that I need? I need security, I need trade, I need partners to accomplish my foreign policy goals. These are some of the things on which I am dependent. Okay, where other states provide those things, and those things are really important to me, I am more dependent on them. This is a fairly straightforward use of the term dependence then. It should resonate with all of us. I'm not doing anything fancy here by defining dependence in this fashion. So what I want to think about, though, lots of times we think about dependence. Sometimes we think about, well, Guatemala is a very small country, hence it's more dependent on everybody else than, say, the United States is. I don't want to think about dependence in that terms. Sometimes we think, okay, well, Mexico is quite dependent on the United States, so we use it in that sense, that one country is dependent on another. That's also not the way that I want to go. I want to think about dependence networks. That is, for any given state, a dependence network is a set of partner states with whom it regularly engages in exchanges of valued goods. So every state in the world has a dependence network. And every state's dependence network is different. So if there are, how many states are there in the world? 180, 190? There are 190 states in the world. Each of them has a different dependence network because they all rely on different set of states to a different extent. Now, some of them might be fairly similar. Guatemala and Honduras's dependence networks might look actually fairly similar because they're fairly similar countries. But each dependence network is unique. And I want to think about, okay, do these dependence networks matter? If I am dependent on other states for trade or for security or for foreign policy initiatives, does that influence me? If you think about this in your own lives, you would say, well, I am dependent on a set of people. I am dependent on a set of people for grades, for letters, you would say, yeah, that probably influences your behavior. What does this do to states? Are states also likewise influenced by the set of other states on whom they are dependent? So I want to think about three kinds of dependence networks, as I've just talked about: trade partners, alliance partners, and international organization partners. And what I look at is I not only look at connections, I don't only look at the question, do I trade with, does Guatemala trade with the United States? Does Guatemala trade with Belize? But how much? How important are those countries to my trade? Does Guatemala have a security alliance with somebody else? How important are those other people? So we want to weight. We don't just want to count connections. We don't just want to say, okay, Guatemala is connected to lots of other countries. We want to weight those connections so we capture dependence and not just pure connections. So here's where the cool maps come in. So this then is an example. These are cartograms. So what we've done here, and Guatemala for some reason, at some point earlier this semester, I just kind of picked it out as an example, no particular reason. But it is, so Guatemala is missing, for example, from this map. So this is what we might call Guatemala's geography network within its region. So this is let's see, right? That's Mexico, right? And this is Belize, El Salvador, Honduras. Guatemala is the empty hole there. Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, right? And then clear down to where you get kind of a really squishy Brazil, which is really kind of cool. And this is then, what we're doing is we're weighting these countries by their distance, okay? So we are saying, and this is what scholars typically say, when they say democracy diffuses, what they are saying is that countries that are closest to you have more impact in your polity score, your democracy score, than countries that are farther away from you. And what this map does then is just represent this graphically. So what this is distances from Guatemala's capital city to the capital cities of these various countries, and then we invert them and weight them. Okay, so the closer you are, the bigger you are on this map. So this suggests then that the biggest influence on Guatemala's democracy ought to be Belize, Honduras, El Salvador. These are, I can give you the figures that sort of underlie this. For example, Mexico has a 5% weight. Panama has the same 5% weight. So Mexico and Panama are about equidistant from, their capital cities are about equidistant from Guatemala's capital city. Okay, so that's 5% of the total weight is assigned to Mexico, 5% of the total weight is assigned to Panama, and so forth. Okay, and then what scholars look for is they look for correlations then. They look for correlations between the democracy scores in these various countries and Guatemala's democracy scores. And they have in fact found that. They have in fact found that region and geographic closeness is an important predictor of your democracy score. So this is the current finding in the literature. Okay. What I want to do is I want to introduce some different kinds of weights and different kinds of networks, not just this geography network. So here, for example, is Guatemala's International Organization Network. Now, what this is weighted by the percent of partnerships that Guatemala shares in important international organizations with any given country. So we take the most important international organizations and we say, okay, which important international organizations is Guatemala a member of? Turns out there's 11 or so of them. It says, okay, so which countries does it share membership with? And then you weight that. And it turns out that everybody's weighted about the same because Guatemala shares memberships. It shares like 6 of its 11 memberships with the United States, and 6 of its 11 memberships with Spain, and 6 of its 11 memberships with France, and 6 of its 11 memberships with Germany, and so forth. Now there's a little bit of variation there. But this is why then you get, the United States being about the same size as Great Britain, being about the same size as France or Germany or Spain or Portugal or what have you. They're all about the same size because they're all more or less equally weighted in an IO network. Guatemala doesn't seem to favor any one country when it joins IOs. Okay, so Africa is really important here. Europe is important. Asia a little bit less so perhaps. But a lot of states equally important here, which means that states that we're used to seeing big geographically get all shrunk down to show that they're equally weighted as everybody else. Here is Guatemala's security network then. Guatemala has a security alliance only with Western Hemisphere countries, not with Europe or Asia or Africa. And here then the United States is a big old balloon. Because the United States, here this is weighted by security capabilities. The United States has way more capabilities than anybody else, so it gets 62%. In fact, this is misleading because Alaska is cut off. If we throw Alaska on there, it's a big old additional balloon. The United States is 62% of Guatemala's security network as of 1995. So it is heavily weighted then when we're looking at security network scores. Mexico is 6%, Brazil is 11%, so they're sort of where we might expect them. The big story, Canada is 5%, so it's kind of shrimpy in this particular map. Okay, and then the last network that we look at is the trade network. So this is Guatemala's trade network in 1995. And here again, the United States is kind of a big old balloon, and you can see kind of what Alaska looks like if you include it. And in the trade network then, Guatemala does 42% of its trade with the United States. Hence, the United States is weighted 42% as we examine this network. Other big contributors to Guatemala's trade are Germany. That's the country in the middle there, the big European country. Japan, this is South Korea, this is China. Different countries have different kinds of weights. Japan 3.5%, Germany 5%. Countries close by are also weighted pretty heavily in this. El Salvador and Honduras are still weighted fairly heavily here. And other Central American countries because Guatemala does a lot of trade with those countries. Okay. So lots of wind-up. So what do I do here? Lots of time spent on those cool maps. So what we do then is we take the average polity score of all of Guatemala's network partners and everybody's network partners, weighted by their capabilities. Okay? So the United States has a polity score of 10. It's worth 42% of Guatemala's security score, and so forth. Okay? What we're looking for then is we're looking for correlations. We're looking for if your network changes and becomes more democratic, and your network could change in two ways. Your network could become more democratic because you change network partners, or it could become more democratic because your network partners themselves become more democratic, right? So your network could change in two ways. If your network changes in 1 year, will your democracy score change the subsequent year? That's what we mean by 1-year lags here. Why would we think this, by the way? Let's just pause for a moment and give some reasons why I'm even pursuing this crazy research. Many states do actually offer rewards or punishment, sometimes anticipated or implicit, for getting the right domestic institutions. Europe does this. The United States does this. I would say, on the other end, that some authoritarian regimes do this as well. China probably does this, and Russia does this. They offer rewards for big states want others to look like them. All states want others to look like them. And they offer rewards and punishments, subtle oftentimes, for doing that. Why else might we think that other states matter? Well, frequent contact might allow powerful states to influence domestic actors. So this happens all the time, right? The United States or Germany or others might be in direct contact with domestic actors in Colombia or Venezuela or Peru or what have you, and be encouraging them to become more democratic or push towards democracy. And the third reason why we might think that interactions with other countries matter is because governments, say you're the head of an authoritarian regime and you're facing domestic unrest and problems and so forth, you're wondering what to do, you're likely to look elsewhere. How did country X handle this problem? I would say that you're likely to look at countries who you're close to, not just geographically, but countries you trade with or countries who you are security partners with. They are likely to be examples, and they're likely to teach you, or at least you will learn from them, whether they're intending to teach you or not. This is why I think that the influence of other countries might matter. So my three main variables then are security networks, trade networks, and I/O networks. We have to add in some important controls to see if those things are in fact correlated in the face of other possibilities. One is region, and like I say, lots of other scholars have found that region matters. And one is global, how many other states are democratic. But also, what about domestics? You know, did domestic politics and economics just not matter at all? I mean, for the longest time, the main thesis in political science has been that democracy arises among wealthy countries, right? Wealth is a driver of democracy, so we definitely need to include wealth in the equation. Is wealth, in fact, correlated with the rise of democracy? That's GDP per capita. The other thing that we might suspect is correlated with the rise of democracy are economic crises or shocks or problems. Right? The more economic problems you have as measured by inflation or growth problems, the more likely regime change is. High inflation induces people to be very unhappy and want a regime change. Steady growth, on the other hand, might actually empower a rising middle class, and even if the country isn't wealthy enough, perhaps steady growth will then push through to democracy. Okay? So these are pretty common hypotheses, and we test them in our models. This then are some of the results, and I'll just kind of flip through these fairly quickly. But notice then that this, again, so here we have influences on democracy. This is during the Cold War. What is correlated with changes in your level of democracy? Again, the level of democracy is the dependent variable. Well, it turns out that your I/O network is pretty highly correlated with changes in your level of democracy, as is regional diffusion, your regional network. So we confirm here the finding of most scholars that region matters for your democracy score, but we also find that your IO network matters, or is correlated with your democracy score, your polity score. Trade and security are not. They're not statistically significant. Now watch what happens with all those domestic level variables. None of them matter. Wealth is not correlated with your change in level of democracy. Inflation is not correlated with your change. Growth is not correlated with your change in level of democracy. None of that stuff. Now, this is a striking finding because it suggests that only international stuff matters. Now, I don't believe that, but this requires further research and investigation and so forth. The only thing that matters is your democracy score last year, and of course, we would expect that to matter. If your democracy score last year is probably going to be correlated with your democracy score this year. Okay, not a surprising finding. What is interesting is that IO networks are correlated with your democracy score, even in the face of your democracy score last year. Okay, this is after the Cold War then. Note, trade becomes important. IOs don't. So after the Cold War, trade partners seem to be more important. During the Cold War, IO partners are more important. The other interesting thing here is that regional diffusion drops out. Region becomes less important after the Cold War. It is no longer correlated with the spread with the level of democracy in your country. This is also then an important finding that sort of challenges the conventional wisdom. And again, what about domestic level factors? What about your domestic economy and so forth? Again, nothing matters. Inflation, growth, wealth, none of it correlated with changes in the level of democracy. Okay, well, these are pretty striking findings. I'm sure they need more testing and more refinement and so forth. This is a substantive effects table. I forgot about this one. This tells us how big of an influence. So if your IO network changes 2 standard deviations, that is, if the weighted polity score of your IO partners changes by about 1 point on that 21-point scale I talked about, minus 10 to 10, if your partners change their level of democracy by about 1 point, your predicted change in level of democracy is a little more than half a point. That's what that 0.57 means. And if your regional partners change by about a point, your predicted change is about 0.6. Okay, so that's a fairly big effect. If your partners are changing in their level of democracy by 1 point, they're pulling you along almost that full point on average. Okay, so not only are these statistically significant, but they're substantively significant. Now, maybe you're thinking to yourself, well, 1 point change on a 21-point scale isn't large. Yes and no. This is just 1 year to the next. If that keeps happening, your IO partners change, they'll pull you along again the next year, and the next year, and the next year. Okay? The trade network effect isn't quite as large, but we think it's because there's fewer years in the post-Cold War sample. So what are the implications here? Well, the implications are that states are influenced by their network partners, and this influence is more consistent across time than geographic diffusion, and it's about the same substantive importance. So IO partners are as important as regional diffusion during the Cold War, and they both had about the same substantive effect. During the post-Cold War period, trade partners were important and regional partners were not. So we'd like to say that dependence networks matter more. Dependence networks matter more than region, and region has been the big finding so far in the literature. IO partners mattered more during the Cold War. Trade partners matter after the Cold War. Domestic economic factors don't matter. I've already highlighted a number of these. And the policy point is that both proponents and critics of exporting U.S. democracy miss this important diffusion mechanism. It turns out that states don't just home grow democracy, nor do they just look at the United States. They seem to look at a variety of partners and respond to them. Now, you might be saying, right, I don't believe that. You're telling me that if Guatemala becomes more democratic, it's because countries in Africa became more democratic? How does that work exactly? Well, that's a very fine question. And what this what this quantitative analysis can do is show us that there's a pattern there, that there is a pattern of correlation between changes in trade in dependence networks and changes in polity scores. What it can't show us as much is the causal story about how this happens on the ground, what happens when the rubber hits the road. So this is where I want to go into my other research. I want to do a case study here. I want to do a case study of Chile. So this was actually the first thing I did in my career. Back when I was doing my dissertation research, I said, I want to go to Chile, and I want to figure out if they responded. Chile suffered a coup. Chile was a long-standing democratic country up until 1973. On September 11th, easy date to remember, 1973, there was a military coup that overthrew a long-standing authoritarian regime in Chile. We all know, hopefully, the name of the guy who headed the coup, General Augusto Pinochet. He remained in power with a military government for the next 17 years. So from 1973 to 1990, Chile was under authoritarian rule. Now, Chile at the same time came under a lot of international pressure to change. And my question when I went to Chile 15 years ago or so was, did Chile respond to all of that international pressure? How? Why? Did they care at all about what everybody else was saying? Did they care at all about all the condemnations that they were receiving in the United Nations and elsewhere? Did they care about sanctions that were being placed on them? Did they care about all of their partners acting against them in any kind of a way? And if they cared, did they respond positively or negatively? Because you can imagine that a country could easily thumb its nose at international pressures and sort of say, hunker down and say, we don't care, we're going to be more authoritarian just because you told us to be less authoritarian, right? We're going to kill more people, we're going to torture more people, we're going to impose harsher repression. There are certainly some countries that seem to do that. This is another of my favorite pictures of Pinochet early on, looking big bad. And here's the junta that helped govern Chile for those 17 years. At first, the junta was everything. Over time, its influence diminished. There's another picture of the junta. So what did I do? I went down there and I tried to interview these guys. I got interviews with some of them. I got lots of interesting interviews with not them, but a lot of their chief political operatives and interior ministers and former heads of security agencies, some of the people who were in charge of the security agencies that did so much to kill, murder, torture, and so forth, went and had interviews with all of them. In the mid-1990s, they were out of power, recently retired, and had very little to do, it turns out, and were quite interested in talking to a North American researcher who was asking them questions about why they did what they did. Now, this has to be taken with a grain of salt, of course, because they're going to spin the story they want. But one day I was talking to the legislative secretary of the junta, asking him a whole bunch of questions, and he said, well, you know, all this is written down. And I said, what do you mean it's all written down? And he said, yeah, we were a duly established legislature. What do legislatures do? They take minutes. I took the minutes personally, and we had them all typed up, and they all exist. And I said, okay, great. Tell me where they are. I didn't believe him. After lots of searching, I found these things. There were like 25,000 pages of the meetings of the Chilean junta. This is what they looked like. This was back in the day when scanner technology was in its infancy. I borrowed a handheld scanner from a mission president and using all of my graduate student ingenuity and spent day after day running that handheld scanner down these typed up minutes. and it only did half a page at a time. You can't really see it on this, but I had to go home at night and align the two halves of the page. It was crazy. This is field research. It's lots of fun. So this is Acta 72. This is, this is the minutes from one particular day. What I did was I didn't have time to get all 25,000 pages. So I identified maybe 1,000 pages that seemed the most relevant and scanned them in. So this is my evidence then. My evidence comes from both interviews with Chilean military government officials and from these documents that recorded the meetings of the junta. And what I do is I divide Chile's history then from 73 to 80 into about 4 periods. And during the first period, it looked something like this. From 73 to 75, the military government said, human rights? What? I love this quote. This is from one of my interviews. Well, then, the military's the military. They implemented a stage of siege. They shot a few people, but they were also shot at a little. What happened at first did not receive much attention. It was seen as a type of war. There were also a lot of people who committed excesses, people to whom morals were not important. After that, the security services began their abuses, let's call them. People said that there were tortures, but no one knew for certain. I believe that after about 1.5 years, people came to see this as a real problem. There was at least a year or more in which there were very few who knew anything or who even realized human rights was an issue. Okay, so what this does is this captures the mindset of the Chilean military from 73 to 75. They were at war. Of course abuses happen at war. It happens. Get over it, right? They didn't see human rights as a problem. Who helped them see human rights as a problem? Well, it was their partners. It was the United States. It was Europe. It was European countries who sent delegation after delegation to Chile to investigate the human rights issues there. And the Chileans were exasperated by this. They had no idea. What are we doing wrong? Literally, they were killing Marxists. Why was that a sin in the Cold War? They couldn't understand. Isn't that what the United States did? Isn't that what other countries did? And they were bedeviled by this. I mean, it's so funny. Like, on September 27, 1973, so this is just 2 weeks after the coup, right? This is an important item on the Chilean, this is from the junta, this is from their minutes. The foreign minister shows up and says, we've got an awful lot of refugees hanging out in the Swedish embassy and the Finnish, and this is really hurting us. This is about the first signal that Chile has that, human rights abuses are a problem. And it comes from its partners. And he was convinced then that the large number of refugees clogging all the embassies was, quote, damaging Chile's foreign image and would need to be resolved. And this is the way they talked about it then for a couple of years. From 73 to 75, they basically said, look, we've got a PR problem. Our image is in tatters, and what they did was they launched offensives. They launched PR offensives. They took out full-page ads in the New York Times. They sent delegates to these countries, these capitals, to sort of try and wine and dine people and convince them that human rights wasn't a big issue. They got really snippy about it. This is the government Secretary General Pedro Ewing. Yes, we're a legal government. We're not a dictatorship of the tropical variety, okay? Dripping with superiority and so forth. We aren't like Guatemala at all. This is a legal government. And finally, in 75 or so, Pinochet finally jumps in the act here. He's very quiet. He doesn't say much in the junta meetings. He governs behind the scenes. But he gives a speech in 75 where he finally sort of says, okay, enough's enough. Yes, I am concerned about this international problem. So 73 to 70 took 2 years or so just for the international community to sort of really get their attention. 76, 77, stuff started changing inside of Chile. They started changing the way they talked about human rights, and more importantly, they started changing some of their practices. So one of the things they did was they tried to regularize and legalize things. They said, and this is a problem, right? Any country where there are human rights abuses, oftentimes we don't realize to what extent I think those abuses are decentralized. They're not necessarily ordered from the top, but rather the top sort of says, go out there and take care of this problem for me, and individual people and individual units go out there and do it. So one of the ways that the Chilean junta tried to get a handle on this was to legalize and regularize things a little bit more. They said, we need some laws. And one of the laws they passed then was sort of a state of siege law. They said, we're going to regularize this. And here was their logic. Chile's going to begin living under a state of siege, which gives you all the powers you want. This is one of the junta's advisors explaining to them why this is a good idea. And at the same time, the name is very presentable because, for example, Colombia lived 20 years under a state of siege and Argentina 14 years. Any country can live in a state of siege and no one becomes alarmed, okay? So they are learning. They are looking at their network and they are borrowing practices from their network. They are saying, look, Argentina, Colombia, they aren't getting hit as hard as we are by other countries. Why is it? The lesson they learned was that Argentina and Colombia had this nice regularized, legalized system. They needed one too. Merino was the naval commander in the junta, and he was especially big on this. He time and again would bring up all the international problems. And he wanted things like, he wanted human rights language. He wanted human rights language adopted. It doesn't mean he wanted human rights practices that were perfect, but he wanted the language to be there. Part of my point here is that Chile moved very slowly, very gradually. To most outside observers, Chile's movement between 1973 and 1990 was imperceptible. You go look at the record, and you can see the groundwork being laid here for later changes. That's part of my point. So he says, you know, what we want to do is that we want to legitimize the situation. He says, if you read down a little bit, because we must remember that what comes out of this moment in the United Nations will be analyzed with a magnifying glass word by word. And if before they attacked us, now they will continue. For this reason, I would like it, and here he challenges the people who are proposing a bill that he has before him. If you told us why or how you consider your judgment to be better than the criticism, not ours, but rather international, that will destroy everything we've written. In other words, how are you so sure that these bills you're presenting us that we're going to enact into law, they're going to solve my international problem? That's what I want you to tell me. What is needed is something that will give the image that whatever's happening, Chile has the most legal character possible. Okay. So you can see then that they were actually pretty concerned about all of this, and they responded. Now, these responses were at first superficial, but as they headed towards 1980, the response became more deep. And what they decided they needed was really a new constitution. So as they headed towards 1980, they drafted a new constitution. Now, this constitution became very important. It is the constitution that still governs Chile today. Despite the fact that Chile moved to a democracy in 1990, they didn't throw away this constitution. They've only amended it slightly. So they essentially wrote a democratic constitution in 1980, 10 years before military rule actually ended. The fact that they wrote this constitution put lots of pressure on them to, in fact, return to democracy as the 1980s proceeded. So they wrote this constitution in 1980 to satisfy all the critics in the world, and it wound up tying their hands and pushing them towards democracy as the 1980s progressed. I'm running out of time, but you can see here a little bit some of the quotes here. The world had to understand that Chile was not simply another Latin American dictatorship, but rather a country that had suffered an institutional crisis. This crisis implied a return to a legal framework and the necessity of setting deadlines to military rule. This one's interesting. In international relations, in the fora of the United Nations and in all places, the ambassadors and their representatives always said, next year, we're going to have a constitution. It will be approved by all the people. And quite reasonably, countries that did business with us began to ask, but when will there be a constitution? And the date was fixed, and it got closer and closer. I believe in the end it was a very bitter pill for Pinochet to swallow. So this constitution was put in place then in 1980, and then became a document that hung around their necks and was used by both the domestic opposition and other countries to try to hold them to their word. One of my most interesting interviews, I'll end with this, was with an Air Force general by the name of Fernando Matei. Now, he was a member of the junta, and he is most famous for, what the Constitution did was it promised a referendum on Pinochet's rule. And it promised that referendum sometime in 1988. So in 1980, Constitution promised it in 88. It looked like Pinochet was losing the referendum. Pinochet called all of his generals to his palace at 2 a.m. or so the night of the voting, and everyone suspected he was going to try to convince them to throw the results, because mysteriously all the computers had gone down and national TV had announced the computers were broken. They couldn't count votes anymore. Pinochet calls this meeting. Matei shows up, gets out of his car, television cameras rolling, says to the television cameras being broadcast to all the country, looks to me like Pinochet lost, before he goes in to see Pinochet. He pulled the rug out from under his president, his leader, his general. And Pinochet could not have been happy with him. I found this guy really interesting as a result. I went and had dinner on his back porch one night. He invited me in at the end of dinner to his library, showed me around his library, said, "What do you notice about it?" I said, "I don't know. What do I notice about it? It's got a lot of books. You're well read. You know, I was trying to be nice, right?" He said, he broke into English. He said, "All of the books here are written in English or German. Not a single one is written in Spanish, because Spanish is a degenerate language and Latin is a degenerate culture. True culture is Anglo-Saxon." Wow, that was a really cool moment. Why did he care so much about his network partners? Well, in part because it was part of his identity, right? In part, he had an identity that said, I am Western. I am Western European. These are people I should care about. That's another layer. I can't tell whether or not he cared about what Germany thought or what the United States thought because of dependence. That's certainly a possibility. Or because of his identity, certainly a possibility. Or likely a combination of both. But for whatever reason, Chilean officials were extremely attuned to what their network partners were saying. Now, not every country in the world is. Just because it happened in Chile doesn't mean it happened in Iraq, for example. Chile and Iraq are very different. Obviously, they reacted very differently to international pressures. Chile and Cuba are very differently. They react very differently. But what the quantitative analysis showed was that on balance, enough countries react positively to what their network partners are doing that it changes their democracy scores. What the Chilean case shows is how this might work in practice. Conclusions? Chilean officials were surprisingly interested in their reputation and standing among other states, especially trade partners and IO partners. Chilean officials also learned from the experiences of other states and their networks. The spread of democracy is not just geographical, it moves along these dependence lines. And the policy conclusion, again, we've missed the most important thing we can do. The most important thing we can do is think about spreading democracy as kind of a network idea, not just a single state or not just growing it from its roots. Thank you very much for coming today.